Hello and welcome back to the Resilience for Life program. We are on session 4, Resilience and Nurturing Connection. So what are we going to cover today? Well, to start with, we're going to do the resilience self-regulation practice. Remember this: stop, reset and prepare. Then we're going to move on and look at some biology and how it relates to empathy. So we're going to explore that. Looking at evolution and compassion, how we're designed to feel connected, to be compassionate with one another. And we're going to explore something called mirror neurons. This is our ability to read what others are feeling and how others can read what we're feeling and how that might help us, but how it can also get in the way. We're going to explore something called the social engagement system, these way that we are in the world, and we're going to look at some of the nervous system physiology behind that. We're going to explore the difference between the story and the storyteller. Sometimes we're trying to get information across and we're really clear in our thoughts, but we're getting in the way by how we're telling the story. The sort of storyteller is either hindering the story or telling different signals. And we're going to explore mindful listening, and I'm going to point you towards a worksheet in your learning zone around developing the skill of mindful listening. Towards the end, we're going to look at self-compassion, so moving from connection with others to connection with yourself, and we're going to look at some simple techniques you can do to understand self-compassion and boost self-compassion, because the evidence shows that people that have more self-compassion perform better, look after themselves well, and have better sense of well-being. And then finally, we're going to look at mapping your support networks. So a little exercise on how you map your support networks, where perhaps you can get more support, where maybe you need to provide less support, and where potentially you need to strengthen your support. So we'll be looking at that as well. So let's get cracking. So let's start, as usual, with the resilience self-regulation practice. Now remember, the first thing you've got to do when you notice that you're a bit dysregulated is stop. Okay, stopping, pausing, finding a way to reset, and then preparing for what's next. So in the next slide, we've got a little video of a nature scene, a nice nature scene down on the south coast, and it's only 30 seconds long, but what I would like you to explore is just taking a moment to pause, have your feet on the floor, and as you're sitting in the chair, have your eyes open, look at the scene, and just practice that rhythmical breathing technique as if you're breathing into your body, out from your body, focusing on your breathing and just watching the scene with a sense of appreciation for what you're seeing. Hope you enjoy this. So hopefully that was useful. We find just taking a moment, just to pause, just to reset the system in between meetings or in between transitional times, perhaps when you're leaving work to go home or when you're leaving the train to come into work. Just pausing, resetting yourself, feeling into your body, noticing what you hear, noticing what you see. Being mindful, being present really helps you to prepare for what's next, what's coming up next. So hopefully that was a useful thing for you to do and continue practicing. The real work takes place practicing when you don't need this, so that when you do need these techniques, they're much easier to do. Nurturing connection. Resilience isn't about being resilient on your own and not having any relationship with anyone else. It's around how you are resilient in your teams, in your families, with your friends, with others that you care for, with others that you work with. And that's what we're going to explore today. And we're going to start by uh, looking at a quote by a very famous man, Mr. Charles Darwin. And most of you will have heard the famous Charles Darwin quote that's cited all the time, which is around survival of the fittest. Well, here's something else Charles Darwin said a lot, and it's not very widely reported or known about, but here's what he said. Charles Darwin really saw human beings that were more connected, more sympathetic to each other, as being more likely to flourish, more likely to have the strongest communities, the most prosperous communities. This isn't talked about very much, but he talked about this quite a lot. And the evidence is emerging that we are an altruistic social species. We are designed to connect. We're not designed to be on our own, just going ahead doing things on our own and not worrying about anyone else. We are designed to be helpful to others and for others to be helpful to us. We're designed to support and be supported. So I think that's really important to hold on to that idea. It's biological. We're hardwired to feel. Now, I'm going to show you some images here of a person with some facial expressions. And I want to see, can you guess what emotion it is that she's feeling? What's she feeling as she pulls these faces? So see if you can have a guess. How'd that go? A little bit slower perhaps? So the likelihood is that you were able to actually read what her emotional flavour was just by seeing her face for a very short period of time. Humans have a highly evolved ability to read what other people are feeling, to read their intentions. Unconsciously, we have this feeling about what's going on for this person right now. Like, for example, you walk into a room and it's a little bit tense. You can pick up on it quite quickly, almost immediately. And this kind of empathy involves an automatic mirroring of what another person is experiencing. It's as if we can literally catch their emotions and we feel them in our body. If you look at these images of an artist, a performance artist called Bill Viola, as you look through them, you may have a kind of emotional response to each of the faces that he's pulling, each of the emotional expressions that he's showing and demonstrating. It's as if we can feel what he's feeling, or at least we know what it is he's feeling. This discovery of mirror neurons dates back to the 1980s in a lab in Italy, and they had a monkey and they had him wired up for brain activity, which was around performing an action. So what they were looking at is the brain would fire in a certain pattern when the monkey performed the movement of eating. So eating a banana, certain activity in the brain. So these neurons in the brain would fire when the monkey performed an action. Now, one day they had the monkey, lunchtime was around, and the monkey's just sitting there still wired up but not performing the action, and lo and behold, the monkey sees the action being performed. So the monkey sees another scientist eating their lunch, and the brain fires in the same sequence as if the monkey was eating the banana. So certain specialized mirror neurons fired when the monkey merely saw the same action being performed, but they weren't doing it. This was the discovery of what we now know are mirror neurons. These are neurons that fire in our brains, in our minds, when we think about something or see something happening in another person. So when you're looking at another person and perhaps they're feeling surprise or sadness or shock or disgust, you literally feel a little bit what they're feeling. You'll all have experienced this if someone gets a paper cut and you see that happening. You can feel the pain. You feel the pain of the other person. You may even get a little shiver down your spine as me saying a paper cut. Our mirror neurons influence how we connect with each other. They have an influence. And this has a relationship to our biology, how we rear our young, how we look after our offspring. If we were reptiles, we would have a very different approach to child rearing. It would be a stack 'em high, sell 'em cheap approach. So reptiles give birth to plenty of offspring, lots and lots of baby turtles born on the beach, and they try and make their way down, and only a few survive. Reptiles aren't known for their parental caring attributes, whereas mammals, we are. We're much more one-to-one, caring, cuddling, and the relationship between the mother and the child is an important one, and it's often an important one in the gaze, in how the child sees the mother and how the mother sees the child, this reciprocal relationship. So there's a regulation that goes on between the mother and the child. That's especially true for humans. Babies self-regulate by the gaze of their mother, and we're very used to that. That's how we rear our young. However, when we're stressed, the mirror neuron firing rate, the literal ability for us to connect with each other, downgrades. We become less susceptible to understanding how others are feeling. We really struggle to feel what others are feeling, and we may misinterpret things about how others are feeling. So one of the things we want to look at is something called the social engagement system. And this really relates to the nervous system, specifically a branch of the nervous system called the vagal nervous system. This is the nerve that goes from the heart to the brain and the brain to the heart. And we have this relatively new branch of the vagal nervous system. So this has evolved quite recently. And this really comes online when we're feeling very safe as human beings. So when you're feeling safe and you're with others, this comes online, and this increases our ability to feel socially engaged because you're feeling safe. So what that means in real terms is your face starts to signal signs of friendliness around your eyes, around your mouth. You smile more. You signal signs of friendliness. You're also able to hear human voice more, so your hearing becomes more tuned to human voice. And then your voice also becomes a little more melodic, so others are more tuned into your voice. But this only really comes about when you're feeling safe enough. So what happens when you're not feeling safe? Well, there's another branch of the vagal nerve which is around the fight-flight response, and this evolved quite a long time ago. And when we're in moderate to extreme feelings of danger, they might not be moderate and extreme danger, it's just a feeling of moderate and extreme danger, we get the fight-flight response. And we looked at that. There's a pretty black and white response. It's like this or it's like that. It's fight or it's flee. Not much need for strong emotional diversity here. It's looking angry or looking fearful. And others can pick that up in us. This person looks really angry, this person looks really scared. And then if we're feeling a little overwhelmed and life-threatening, we've got this third response that can kick in. And this is the freeze response. This is when it feels like we're actually under a real threat. So we may not be under that real threat, but it really feels like this. I call this like the lights are on but no one's home. You may have even had an experience of this. You speak to someone just after an incident like a car crash, and they're just not there. They're not really present. And again, it can be very difficult to have a conversation or relate to someone when they're in the freeze response. So how we communicate depends on how we're feeling. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. So here's a piece of research that was done with 835 British employees looking at what are the biggest drains on resilience at work. And out in the lead was this one: when I am managing difficult relationships and politics in the workplace. This is really pointing towards relational issues. But also, if you look at some of the other ones, like when I feel I'm being personally criticized, or when the volume and the pace of work outstretches my limits. These can all have strong relational components to it. So not being able to seek help, or not being able to say, actually, that I can't quite manage this at the moment, and feeling criticized. So the element that can really get in the way of you flourishing at work is the relational element. And from looking at the social engagement system, we can see how easily it might be that under stressful situations we move from a social engagement response to a social disengagement response. Communication as a source of stress, relationships as a source of stress, has an impact on the workplace and the ability for you to get stuff done, and the ability for you to be happy and for your colleagues to be happy in getting stuff done. We're going to take an opportunity now to look at 4 conversations, so 4 stories. The story is the same in each conversational style, but you'll only be watching the facial expressions. You're not going to hear what's being said. So what I'd like you to do is, as you're watching, notice what you feel as you see each of the 4 stories. What's that like, to see someone speaking in that way? How about this way? Would you like to have a conversation with this guy? How might you feel? What about this guy? Feeling engaged or not? What emotional response do you have to him? How about this guy trying to inspire you to do something or to perform? How about having a chat to him and thinking, this is turning out to be a good appraisal? How we read a situation depends on how we feel about a situation, but how we feel about a situation depends on how we read the situation. What was the story that was being told? Well, just to show you.
Now, here is the shipping forecast. There are warnings of gales in Viking, Forties, Cromarty and Humber. The general synopsis: low, Rockall moving northwards, low.
So, how everyday mirroring has an impact upon how we feel about the other person. So this mirroring contributes to our ability to empathize with others. And on the plus side, this can help us to become sensitive to picking up subtle messages around the storyteller as well as the story and what the needs might be. But on the minus side, we can also catch a person's tension, or we can catch their negative emotions. Now we can begin to avoid this once we start to differentiate in between, is this my stuff, is this their stuff, and also not to go into situations, communication situations, where we're unconsciously contaminating what's being said. Because if we can catch their emotions, guess what? They can catch ours. So this everyday mirroring, this over caring and empathy, on the plus side, our mirroring systems can pick up those subtle messages. They can pick up how someone might be feeling and help us to communicate sensitively. But sometimes, if we get too mentally caught up in someone's needs and catching their patterns of tension, we can get irritated, or we might feel angry, or we might feel just a little bit like constantly trying to rescue someone. And that can be a problem, and it can be tiring because it's not our emotions, or our emotions are spilling out and contaminating others. One way of working with this is something called mindful listening. And you have a worksheet in your packs on the learning zone. But here are the key elements to mindful listening. Number one is to be present. So what does that mean? Well, when you're listening mindfully, your focus should be on the person you're listening to. So you can increase the chances of doing this by removing the distractions, removing phones or Surface Pros, keeping things as clear as possible. Simplify your workspace from distractions. Um, Give yourself some space and time. So don't try and have an important conversation if you've only got 30 seconds. Give yourself some space. Spend a bit of time having that conversation. That can have an impact upon how you're heard or how you listen. The other thing you can do is cultivate or have a feeling of appreciation for the person you're listening to. Now, you may not agree with everything they say, but instead of jumping in quickly to discount them, or cutting them off mid-sentence because you want to say something, if you pause for a moment and have an appreciation for what it is that they're trying to say, and listen to them and let them finish a sentence, the likelihood is the conversation will go much better. And you might also catch some new ideas, and there might be some new insights that can really help with the problem that you're trying to solve, or with the conversation you're trying to have. Finally, I would suggest listen for your own distracting patterns. Do you have a habit of immediately discounting? Or do you have a habit of saying, oh yeah, that happened to me also? So you're jumping in and interrupting to let the person know that this has happened to you. What kind of things do you do that get in the way of good conversation? So mindful listening can be really, really helpful. One way to begin mindful listening is when you're preparing for a conversation, just practice the self-regulation exercise before. So practice the breathing exercise. We're now going to look at something called a model of self-compassion. So we've looked a little bit around, how we can influence others and be influenced others in a positive or negative way. So Kristen Neff, a researcher, came up with this very nice model of self-compassion, and it has three elements to it. The first one is mindfulness, common humanity, and compassion. So what does that actually mean in terms of practice? Well, the first thing is mindfulness. When you're causing yourself unnecessary suffering, or beating yourself up, or overly stressed, the first piece is noticing that you're actually doing that. For example, if you're walking down the street and there's a homeless person who really needs some help, you can only offer them help if you notice they're there. So being mindful that this person is suffering is the first stage. Likewise for yourself. Now, the second stage that Neff talks about is common humanity. This is common humanity versus isolation. When things don't go as well as we thought, when we make mistakes, quite often we can become a bit isolated, and we can start to think about it as if we're the only ones that do that. We're the only ones that make mistakes. We're not good enough. So broadening that and saying, others make mistakes too. This is a common human experience. Takes some of the wind out of that sail. And then the third element is something called compassion. Now, compassion is quite different from empathy. Empathy is just feeling that another person is suffering, or feeling another person's pain, or feeling your own pain. Compassion is feeling the pain or feeling the suffering, and then having a genuine willingness to try and alleviate that suffering. So what would you need to do to move forward? So it might be taking a break, it might be going to speak to someone, it might be doing a self-regulation practice, it might be going and connecting in a certain way. So this is a very, very useful exercise, and we're going to explore what that might look like in day-to-day life. So here's a little reflective exercise. And it's called How Would I Treat a Friend? So you can do this with your eyes open or your eyes closed. But what I'd like you to do is think about a friend or a loved one, someone that you really, really care about. Now imagine they come to you and they say, hey, look, I've made this mistake at work. I've really messed up. I can't believe I did what I did. I feel so stupid. And they seek help from you. How would you speak to them? What kind of words would you use? What tone of voice would you use? Maybe you can call it to mind now. How do you support them? What do you say? Hopefully you've got a flavour of how you would respond. Okay, now let that go. Now I want you to call to mind the last time that you made a mistake, that you messed up at work. How did you speak to yourself? What kind of voice did you use? What tone did you use? What kind of things did you say? How did you support yourself? Really call that to mind. Got it? Well, if you're like most people, you speak and support your friend, you speak to and support your friend far more compassionately and genuinely than you do to yourself. I think it's 78% when they did the research supported their friend better than they supported themselves. So that's significant, because here's the thing. Do you remember that old part of the brain that we talked about called the amygdala, like the smoke alarm? That part of the brain cannot differentiate between an external threat and your own voice beating yourself up. It can't differentiate between that. So it creates the stress response, which closes down your ability to think clearly, and it closes down your ability to do the job and connect with each other. It makes you a little more stupid and a little less friendly. It will also make you sick in the long run. So one thing you can do is, when you have messed up, speak to yourself as if you would speak to a close friend. Now that doesn't mean just ignoring the fact that something went wrong and not trying to fix it, but liberating yourself so you come up with better solutions. Now you can take what's known as a compassionate break, and we're going to show you a video now of something using compassionate touch to support yourself when you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed from making mistakes. So watch this and you can practice it along with Kate as she's going through the process.
So this is an exercise called calming touch, and to begin with, if you just get comfortable in your chair, and you can do this exercise with your eyes open, with a soft focus, or with your eyes closed, whatever suits you. I'm going to ask you now to just place one hand on your cheek and see if you can get that touch just perfect. You might need to change the pressure or change the position. And notice how it feels, what you feel when you're gently touching your cheek. And then I'm going to ask you to cradle your face with both hands. And again, see if you can get the touch perfect. Play around with positions and pressure to see what feels like it's most calming, most soothing. Then I'm going to ask you to just gently stroke one of your arms. And you can play around with speed and pressure, direction, maybe even giving your arm a little squeeze. And just notice what feels good for you when you do that. And then cross both arms over as if you're giving yourself a little mini hug. Perhaps giving a little gentle squeeze of your arms. And again, noticing how that feels. Then I'm going to ask you to place one hand over your heart. Again, be experimental, get the position right, position that feels calming or soothing to you. And then place two hands over your heart. And perhaps you could try some movements, maybe a little circular rubbing, or side to side, maybe a bit more pressure. And then place one of your hands over your abdomen. And again, noticing how that feels. Then just to finish, just see if you can cup both of your hands in your lap in a supportive gesture. And I'm just going to ask you some questions about the experience, your experience of that. So, you had all these different ways of calming touch, soothing touch. Did any feel particularly useful in the sense that you might be able to use it at a time when perhaps you feel a little distress or a little unease or discomfort, perhaps when you feel a little lack of self-compassion?
So I noticed, particularly when I placed my hands over my heart and I could feel the warmth of my hands, that felt very soothing to me. And also it was interesting that I noticed that when I put my hands on my lap, that's actually something that I do quite often. But I hadn't previously noticed that was something I found soothing. So it's interesting for me to now recognise that that's something that I can do to soothe myself when I need to.
That's great. And I think this is a mammalian response. This is how we nurture our young. This is how we nurture each other. And it's something that we can do with ourselves. And people are doing it all the time. So you might be in a meeting and you look around and people are doing all sorts of self-soothing, self-calming activities, maybe stroking their hair or twiddling their rings or stroking their hands. But they're doing it unconsciously. So this exercise really helps you to uncover and to learn some of those gestures, some of those movements or those positions that really soothe you and calm you and help you. And you can do it consciously in the future when you need to. So you can really experiment with this and find a position that works for you. And some are very subtle, so no one needs to know or see.
So finally, we're going to explore support network mapping, how you might identify sources of support, how you might identify sources of potential support that you might need in the future, and how you might really nurture the support that you currently offer and maybe lessen some of the support, maybe if you're supporting too much. So to get a bit of balance in supporting and really identify what you're doing well and what might not be working. So you have a resource sheet on your learning zone around this with some instructions, and it's around mapping your support network. So here's how you do it. So on your worksheet you'll have a center point, which is you, and then you start to draw arrows to areas of potential support that you have to offer. So for example, this person here offers a lot of support to their young one, to their child. So all the support is from the person to the child. That's exactly as it should be. Now they also support their team. So they have an arrow towards their team, but their team also supports them. So they draw an arrow back towards themselves. So there's an arrow now going to the team and an arrow going back to the person feeling supported. Now you can change the kind of thickness of the arrow depending on how much support you give or receive. So for example, there might be times when the team supports you more, or there might be times when you need to support the team more. So identifying which direction is the support most happening helps you to identify how much support you're giving, how much support are you receiving. Is it appropriate? Is it adequate? Is there balance in that respect? Now also the person might have friends, and they may feel very supported by their friends, and they may support their friends, but sometimes they might find themselves needing to offer a lot of support, but sometimes that might feel a bit overwhelming. So how do you get balance in supporting friends and being supported by friends? There are also areas in terms of your support network where perhaps you need a bit more professional support. So maybe you're being asked to do something that you don't quite have the skills for. So you might need to identify, where would I need to get support for the job I need to do? How would I identify this? It might be seeking help from your line manager, or seeking help from other professionals that might be able to help you, or other people that know how to do something. And then there are, the classic things like your pets or something like that, which often, they support you as much as you support them. And then finally, there might be other elements outside of work. So for example, there might be times when you need some financial advice or some financial support. So by doing this, you begin to get a picture of what is my support network? Is there a balance between who I'm supporting and who I'm being supported by? Now for some people you might do this exercise and find all of your arrows are pointed out and you're not being supported well yourself, in which case it's okay to try and seek some support, so to get that balance, so there's a good level of support for you, so that you can support the people that you love and the people that you care for. Because what you don't want to have happen is you spend all your time supporting others and you don't get the support you need for yourself. So it's a really, really good reflective tool. It gives you a really good visual idea of how well you're supported, and the worksheets on the learning zone. It's only useful if you do something with the information, if you identify support needs, if you identify support balance, and if you potentially try to readdress some of the areas where you are imbalanced. So it's a very good exercise to do, and hope you enjoy doing it and that it's useful. Well, that's it for today. We look forward to seeing you in the next round, which is session 5, where we'll be talking about tapping your inner wisdom. See you then. Bye for now.